Terry Rizzo. I am the chairwoman of the Florida Democratic Party. And I'm so excited to see all of you here today, and super excited for the program that you're going to hear. We are extremely privileged today to have one of the fighters for fair voting, one of the leaders in this category, someone who is exceptionally important, the woman who ran for governor for the state of Georgia last year, the first African-American woman to run for governor in the country. Someone who is leading the charge for voting, for fair voting, and to make fair voting for youth, and especially on college campuses. I am privileged to introduce to you someone who is going to introduce that person. John Monesteem, who is your commissioner from this district.
Give it up for Terry! Democrats, are you ready? Well, good afternoon and welcome to Miami-Dade County District 2. As the Miami-Dade County Commissioner for District 2, I am honored to host today's Florida Democratic Party's Voter Protection Town Hall meeting. Privilege to introduce this dynamic leader, this esteemed speaker, as we welcome her to Miami-Dade County and especially to District 2, Miss Stacey Abrams.
Try and get somebody in trouble, man. I'm a visitor. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you to Clifton for the incredible invitation. Thank you to Terry for leading the Florida Democratic Party to victory. So my name is Stacey Abrams, and I am not the governor of Georgia.
Senator.
I'm not going to be the senator ever. Yeah, I do. But what I am is a proud Southerner. I'm a proud Democrat, and I believe that we will win.
Yes.
Now, I know Monday caused a few ripples, but here's the difference. People of good intention can make mistakes.
Yes.
But we have to recognize that the Republican Party intends for us to be quiet. And that's not a mistake. And it's also not new. I grew up in Mississippi. My parents are from Hattiesburg. I grew up in Gulfport. I like to say I was raised in Mississippi and I came of age in Georgia. When I was growing up in Mississippi, we used to go and visit my grandparents. Both my mother's mother and my father's parents lived in Hattiesburg. And we would get in the car and drive the hour north to go and visit them. And I got to be very close to my grandparents, especially my dad's parents. They survived longer than my other grandparents. And so during my race for governor in 2018, when my grandmother was increasingly ailing, I made a trip home to go and visit her. She lived with my parents. My parents had taken their room and turned it into space for her to live when she couldn't live on her own anymore. They moved into a smaller room down the hall because that room was outfitted better. And in my grandmother's room, she had a recliner that she basically lived in. And she used it to command MSNBC to tell her what she needed to know. When I came home to visit, I walked into the room and I did what we all do. You kiss grandma, and then you sit on the edge of the bed that's right by her recliner. And my grandmother's name is Wilter. My grandfather's name was Walter. Yes. And they called each other Bill and Jim. I was confused for a very long time. I'm like, who are these people? So I went to go visit my grandmother, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and she and I did what we always did when I came to visit. She asked me if I was getting enough sleep. No. She asked me if I was taking care of myself. No. She asked me if I was dating. No. And then we started talking about my election. And this is mid to late fall. It's after the cartoon villain who was my opponent, Brian Kemp, was exposed for many of the things that he had done. He was exposed for having put 53,000 voters on hold, suspending their registrations using a system that he knew was racially discriminatory because he was under a federal consent order to not use that system. He had purged 1.4 million voters. He had purged the single largest number of voters in a single day in American history. He had shut down 214 polling places. As he didn't do it himself, as he will tell you, he just oversaw the process and didn't object. And that led to between 50 and 60,000 Georgians not being able to vote based on an independent analysis. We knew a lot of these things at that point, but we didn't know all of it. And as I sat on the bedside, what my grandmother knew was what she had seen on Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes, and that was that he was mean. And she gripped my hand and she said, "Are you going to be okay, baby?" And I said, "Yes, Grandma, I'll be fine. We're going to keep fighting. We have a voter protection team, the only one in the country that has been full-time for more than a year. We have a way to win. And we have multiple scenarios for what can happen." And then she squeezed my hand a little tighter. Her voice was getting a little weak. And she said, "I wish I lived in Georgia so I could vote for you." And I said, "You did a pretty good job of making sure I was here, so we're good. We're okay." And she said, "I want to tell you about when I voted for the first time." My grandmother explained to me that the first time she was truly eligible to vote was after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but as with most federal decisions, it didn't really get to Mississippi until 68. And so the first time she was eligible to vote in an election was in the presidential election of 1968, and she remembered that day. My grandfather and his brother LP were at the house gotten off of work, and they were ready to take her to go and vote. My grandmother and grandfather lived in this tiny house with a room in the back, their bedroom, and my grandmother's in the back room, my grandfather and others were sitting in the front room, and he called. He's like, "Sugar Honey," which is what he called her. I'm telling you, I was very confused about who was in my family. And he called her and he said, "Wilter, it's time to go. Bill, come on." And my grandmother said she didn't move. She was sitting back there on that bed and she was frozen. My grandfather became less and less generous with his platitudes and more impatient with her not showing up, and he finally marches back there to get her. He's like, "What's wrong? We got to go and vote." And she said, "I don't want to go." And my grandfather's like, "What do you mean you don't want to go?" And she said, "I don't want to face the dogs and the billy clubs. I don't want to face the problems." And he said, "But we've got the right to vote. We've got the Voting Rights Act. We can vote." And she said, "I'm afraid. I don't want to do this." And my grandfather looked at her and she said she'd never seen my grandfather look so disappointed. He said, "Your children fought for this." Because my grandparents lived at a time where, yes, they were supporters of the civil rights movement, but if they had lost their jobs, their entire family would have been ruined. And so they supported the movement the best way they knew how, but their children they'd raised, my father and my aunts and uncles, they had been frontline members of the civil rights movement as teenagers. At the age of 14 or 15, my father was arrested registering black people to vote in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and my grandfather looked at my grandmother and said, "Wilter, your children went to jail for this. If they were brave enough to fight for it, you gotta be brave enough to vote." And she said she sat there trapped by her fear, but the only thing stronger than her fear was her shame. And she was embarrassed that she was afraid to go. And she screwed up her courage and she went with my grandparents and they went to cast a vote, and my grandmother never missed another election in her life. A few months after my election in 2018, my younger sister was having drinks with some friends, and there was a young woman sitting next to her who, when she realized that Janine was my sister, said, "Oh, I voted for your sister." And my sister made some glib comment, and she's like, and the woman said, "Yeah, they stole it from her." And she said, "That's why I'm never voting again." And my sister said, "What do you mean you're never going to vote again?" She said, "Because it's a rigged system. They're going to steal it from her. Why bother trying?" And what my sister said to her is, "You have to try because it only works when the theft works." when they convince you not to bother trying anymore. And for a long time, I've been thinking about my grandmother and her fear and her shame, and this young woman who doesn't know me but became convinced because of what happened to me that she shouldn't bother trying. And we have to recognize that the challenge of voter suppression is not simply that you've been blocked from voting, it's that you get afraid of trying because the disappointment is so strong. And I'm here today because I'm afraid for those college students who changed the face of Florida in 2018, who ensured that Amendment 4 became law even if Andrew Gillum didn't become governor. Those 60,000 young people who used the right to vote early to cast their ballots and lift their voices. And what we saw in response was a Florida legislature that not only stripped the rights away from felons, from returning citizens who had fought to get them back, they secretly snuck in there an asinine bureaucratic mess about non-permitted permitted parking. What they were saying is you should be afraid to vote. You should be afraid that the power is possible. They're trying to scare these young people out of lifting up their voices because they know if their voices are heard, our country changes. Not just Florida, our country changes. Our country changes. You see, we know that young people, what my grandmother knew, what made her get up off that bed, what made her hold my hand by that bed, was that she understood the power of young voices. The fact that her son went to jail as a teenager for a right that he would not have for another decade, possibly. Because this is before the 26th Amendment. When you couldn't vote till you were 21. You could die at 18, but you couldn't vote till 21. She remembered the 15th Amendment that for the first time said black men had the right to vote. Not black women, black men. The 19th Amendment that finally allowed women to be heard. She understood the power of our Constitution, but the reality is the Constitution just gives us permission. It doesn't give us our full rights. Because every time they have passed a constitutional amendment, they have delegated to the states the authority for implementation. And when you delegate to a racist, classist, discriminatory system the authority to decide who can be heard, they are never going to choose the people who will create change. But I'm fighting this fight because the people who can create change can be heard anyway. You see, I ran an election where I ran against literally the man in charge of counting the votes. That's like Tom Brady being the referee at one of the 48 Super Bowls he played in. As well as the scorekeeper and the announcer. And yet, I received more Democratic votes than any person in the history of the state of Georgia. We tripled Latino turnout among Democrats. We tripled Asian Pacific Islander turnout. We increased black participation rates by 40%, which doesn't sound as exciting as tripling, until you realize that in 2014, 1.1 million Democrats voted for governor. In 2018, 1.2 million black people voted for me. Amen. But what cut across all of those numbers is the number I want you all to remember here. We increased youth participation rates by 139% in the state of Georgia. Young people of every race, young people of every community showed up and they showed out, and they were not deterred by someone who didn't want them to be heard. We understood young people had to be the lead, as they have led us on so many things. I am no longer as young as I used to be. But I remember, and I know I can count. I remember being a college student at Spelman College. I remember registering young people to vote and being told that voting doesn't matter back in 1991 and 1992. I remember people being dismayed by the Gulf War, believing that it didn't matter what they wanted because the people weren't listening. The difference is, the more of us who show up, the more they have to listen. We have to remember that voter suppression is designed not simply to strip us of the right to vote, it's designed to strip us of the will to vote. And it only works if we let it. I have every right to be sitting on my couch, binge watching Picard, and watching the days go by. I had an election where I told people across the state of Georgia that they invested and they trusted that we would have an election where every vote could count. And they made a lie out of me. But it's only true if I give up. If I let them strip away our power, if I let them tell us who we are and what we can do. But in the 10 days between election day and my non-concession day, which is how I like to refer to the day I told them, yes, he might be governor, but this system isn't going to stand. In that 10-day period, I thought about what work could I do? Because so often we think about elections as about people, about the person standing for office, about wonderful commissioners and fantastic state legislators and governors and senators. It's not about the politician. Politicians are proxies. We are avatars to speak your will into existence. And when we let people convince us that candidates are the reason we vote, then we have already lost. We need to hire people to do the work of fighting against gun violence and fighting for smart gun safety in America, in the state of Georgia. We deserve to have leaders who recognize that climate action isn't a nice to have, it is a need to have, because I don't want to die. Who understand that social justice isn't just a tagline. It's the difference between whether someone enjoys the liberty and justice that we speak of in our creed, or if it's just a mirage. When black and brown people have to worry about being shot to death by those who are supposed to protect them, and when those who protect them don't know where they stand in our communities, we need leaders who will speak up and speak out and speak together. That's what voting is. Voting is power, and I will not let anyone steal my power. And so in the 10-day period, I thought about what work could I do. I may not have the title. I certainly don't have the budget. But I've got the time. And so I launched Fair Fight. We sued the state of Georgia because that system may have allowed him to win, but it will not stand. And I may acknowledge the legal sufficiency of that election, but I will never acknowledge the legitimacy of that system. And we are going to fight to make it right. But we also launched Fair Fight Action because we know that what happened in Georgia happened in Florida, happened in Texas, happened in Wisconsin, happens across this country because they know change is coming. And it's coming faster than they can imagine, and they're working harder than they ever have to stop it. But the way to beat voter suppression is not by giving in, it is by fighting harder, by overwhelming the system with who we are and what we believe in. I am here because I know Florida, you can get it done. And so I'm here because I believe in a fair fight. We're not guaranteed victories. We can fix the systems and I still might not win. But at least I know that I've done what I can to make sure the people win. That the voters win. That we can select our leaders who believe in us. Because unless we have people who believe that we have the right to be here, the right to be wholly who we are, who can see us and trust us, and do the job we've hired them to do, then we don't have a fair fight. And whether it's early voting on college campuses, or making sure that the signature mismatch goes away, no matter what the problem is, we can defeat it because we have before. Because the 3/5 compromise was killed by the 15th Amendment. The denial of women as citizens of America was killed by the 19th Amendment. Young people came into their own with the 26th Amendment. They have tried since the inception of this country to tell us who we are and who we're not. But I remember my grandmother. Nobody's going to tell me who I am. And no one's going to tell me how American I am. I will tell you every time at the ballot box, so I need you to join me. Thank you so much. Macro, here's what what we do. Fair Fight exists in two ways. There's Fair Fight Action, which is our C4 that's based in Georgia, but we work across the country. We work with other groups on these issues. And there's Fair Fight 2020. Fair Fight 2020 is our national strategy to fight voter suppression in the 20 battleground states. We were in Kentucky, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and Virginia in 2019, and we had a few successes. When Matt Bevin, the Republican, tried to purge 175,000 voters, we got 140,000 back on the rolls. He lost by 5,000 votes. When Eddie Raspone and the Republican Party tried to hamper black voters from turning out in the runoff in Louisiana, Fair Fight was working with the state party there to make sure that those voters were able to vote, and John Bel Edwards was reelected. Mississippi, we had a little less success, but we started to close the gap, and Virginia basically is now a Democratic paradise. So what we do for Fair Fight is we work in state parties. We are partners with the parties. Because parties, and I know there's a lot of conversation about what parties are and parties aren't, but let's be clear. In the country that we live in, we are not a parliamentary system, we are a party system. And what that means is that parties have special legal rights that no one else has. Parties alone can put poll observers inside polling places. Parties alone are entitled to certain information. And so as much as we may disagree sometimes with the party has the power and has the ability to galvanize and organize us, and we have to respect that. And so what Fair Fight does is in those 18 states where we are, because we've taken care of Kentucky and Louisiana, the other 18 states, we are part of the state parties. We are helping, we have hired for them election protection directors, deputy directors, field organizers, and hotline managers. Voter suppression happens year-round. In Florida, it looks like shutting down early voting places, but it's also strict voter ID laws across the country. It's can you register and stay on the rolls? Do you have access to the ballot? And does your ballot get counted, which I often refer to as Florida. And the reality is that those are three things, those are three macro things, but they happen in different ways. We have 50 different democracies in America. Every state gets to interpret the laws the way they want to. And so what we are doing is working directly with folks like Terry to make sure that in the state of Florida, we are helping anticipate what voter suppression will look like. And then we're going to use the March primary, the August primary, and the November election to fight voter suppression. But the difference is we're not waiting until November to realize the problems are coming. We started last November. And if you want to help, go to fairfight.com, sign up as a volunteer. We will connect you to the places where we need you. And let's be clear, you don't have to have voter suppression in your state to fight it across the country. When they tried to purge 300,000 people in Georgia, we had folks from around the country calling 100,000 Georgians to remind them to get back on the rolls. We got 4,500 people put back on. We got 22,000 people put on because we sued. That's just the beginning. So fairfight.org, sign up, we'll call on you, we need you, thank you.
I think you addressed this a little bit already, but with voter protection being such a huge issue in your gubernatorial race, what are some potential issues that we might see in the presidential race, and how can we be proactive, and what can we do to, fight that on our own besides the ways that you've already mentioned?
Sure. So the issue with voter suppression is, again, it's not like the 1960s. It's not like what my grandmother was afraid of. Back then, you knew what the laws were. You can't vote. It's pretty simple. What they've done now is they use administrative hurdles to convince you that it's just too hard. So America's one of the only industrialized, democratized nations that puts the responsibility of voter registration on the voter. In almost every other nation, you are automatically registered. You got to work to get yourself off the rolls. America is one of the only places where you have to work to get on the rolls and stay there. And so the first issue is making sure everyone you know is registered. Do not assume the people you know are registered. Even if they run their mouths about who they hate in politics, do not assume that they've ever done a thing about it. So first and foremost, make sure the people you know are registered. Ask the question. Be so annoying that they get registered just to get you to shut up. Number two, make sure we energize people. Folks get despondent about voting. I don't believe in voter apathy. I believe in voter despair and voter disillusionment. When you grow up in intergenerational poverty, you have no reason to trust a single politician. And when you try to vote and your vote gets thrown out because your absentee ballot gets rejected, or it never shows up, which is another issue here in Florida, then you start to believe the system really is rigged, and it is. But we can unrig the system by making the system work and holding it accountable. And so part of it is that we need to tell people when there is a problem, don't assume it's your fault. Because what voter suppression does, it's so insidious because it feels like user error. If I was smarter, if I had done this. No, we spend billions of dollars to pay people to do this. When it breaks, it's not us who broke it. And so make sure people report what they've seen. Don't just keep it to themselves or feel like, well, if I'd done this, I wouldn't have been. No, the system works for you. You shouldn't have to work the system. So number one, register people. Number two, report what you hear. And number three, volunteer. It doesn't have to be that you volunteer for a presidential campaign. In America and Florida, y'all have elections all the time. Voter suppression doesn't just happen with the presidential election. It actually is hyper-localized. It's the worst when it's the low-level elections, because nobody shows up, so nobody pays attention. We need to show up everywhere at every election. It's like working a muscle. But the thing is, we've got to increase the weight on that muscle, because if we're good at voting, we've got to increase the weight by getting other people to vote. So take your good intentions and work with a campaign to spread those good intentions. So register, report, and volunteer. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for being here, giving us an opportunity to voice our concerns. My question is specifically about the Haitian community, and basically the past couple of years, we've been getting hit by comments from our leadership, our Republican leadership, and I noticed from the people I spoke to in the community that they're losing a lot of confidence in our democracy. So what are the things that that's being done or that we can do to kind of help bring the Haitian community out to vote, to bring back the excitement in democracy, that we are part of the democracy to vote? What can we do as students, people in the community, and leaders as yourself?
Thank you. So we have to remember that the 2016 election was decided by 77,000 votes across 3 states. 77,000 across 3 states. We cannot undo Russian interference, and we need to anticipate that we're going to have Russian, Iranian, Chinese, North Korean, Myanmar might be mad, who knows? So we can't do foreign interference because our Republican-led Senate refuses to actually take action. We're going to have Republican disinformation. They're going to lie about what's happening. There was a consent decree that has been in place since 1981 that told Republicans that they could not engage what's called ballot security measures. Back in 1981, they used to hire off-duty officers, have them wear quasi-official armbands, walk around with two-way radios and guns at black and brown polling places, and put up signs saying that you will be monitored if you vote at this location. In 1981, it was so egregious that they were put under a federal consent decree that lasted for 35 years. Guess what? 2017, it was lifted. 2020 is the first presidential election where Republicans can do it again. Only this time, it's not just going to be police officers if they do it. It's likely going to be police officers and off-duty ICE officers and others. So we can't stop them from doing what they now have the legal authority to do. But what we can control is making sure that we show up in numbers. That is the only true antidote to voter suppression. We're going to try to fix the laws. I'm doing my best. I'm working with groups that are suing pretty much everyone. It's so bad in Georgia that they just ask for more money in the budget because of all the lawsuits. But it's a good thing, because when they're playing defense, that means that it's harder for them to do things that are offensive. But we have to remember that our greatest antidote is our presence. The Secretary of State ran the election and still barely eked out a 1.4% victory against me. In Florida, it was even closer. You all lose vote. The election difference is a suburb. And the Haitian community can fill that void. But they have to hear from people who look and sound like them, who they can trust. One more thing. So they have to hear from you, but they also have to hear why it matters. because often they get tidbits of information about what's gone wrong. They need you and your allies with the Democratic Party to help them understand what is at stake and how they can fix it, because often people are just mad at the president. But this stuff doesn't just happen at the top. And so it's making sure that you are helping educate and the community gets educated, because it's not enough to want to vote. You gotta know what you're voting for and why.
Thank you. I'm really sorry to have to disappoint everybody, but Leader Abrams has to go. And one.
I'm gonna go really fast because she's a student.
Okay.
Here's what we're gonna do. You cannot give a statement. You have to do a really quick question.
Yes.
And then very quick questions, and then I will wrap it all into one big answer.
So I wanted to know how we as young people, especially here in Miami, can actually help our community as well as ourselves in voter protection. What things can we do to actually ensure voter protection for our community, as well as like what can organizations do and what advice can we give to our community, especially what we have here in South Florida, a bunch of different type of island people, language barriers. We have a bunch of different things that we're fighting against.
Thank you. So go really fast.
So my question is, I think we can all agree that the Electoral College needs to be abolished. And I know that about 16 states have already voted to give their electoral vote to the winner of the national popular vote. How effective is this process in the long run versus constitutional amendment?
Okay. Next.
I was hoping to get your thoughts on what we could do to incentivize local governments to make public transit free on election day.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Melba Pearson. I'm running for Miami-Dade County State Attorney on a progressive platform, and I just want to say that you're a part of the reason why I'm doing this, because you inspired me. And if you have any words of wisdom, because this is going to be a big uphill fight for me. Thank you.
Say it really loud. I'll wrap it in. No, just say that.
Oh, okay. I am a parent of a murdered child, and I heard you talking about gun violence was going to be one of your priorities. And I wanted to know, do you have your plan ready already of what we can fight against and where it can start from?
Yeah.
You know, did you put a plan in place already on how you're going to deal with gun violence?
Okay. So guys, I gotta stop now. So one more. Yes, sir. She's got the microphone.
I'm not finished though.
She's going to answer the question.
I'm gonna answer. Yes, ma'am. So if you'll give her.
Oh,
Yes, ma'am. I'm gonna answer. It's okay. No problem.
If you were to become Secretary of Education, what would you do to change education and what's going on right now with the Education Department?
Okay. Okay. So starting with who's the one more, guys? Y'all said one more like 4 times.
It's actually listening.
Okay.
Hello. Thank you for being here. You're my shero, first of all. Many of the male vice presidential candidates for our party have already put out there that they're definitely going to choose a woman as a running mate. And I know I've heard you on a few of the shows saying that you're not going to be a part of that. You're going to continue to put your voice in this fight. Will you reconsider if seriously approached, and because of the powerful voice, intellect, and enthusiasm that you bring to the table, would you
We are running out of time. I'm trying to cover everybody. Number one, young people, what can you do? What can young people and young organizations do? We have to remember there are 3 steps to getting voters to turn out. The first is education. Voter suppression works because people don't know what it looks like. So if you go to our website, fairfight.org, we talk about what voter suppression is and how to fight it. Make sure people are educated about their right to register, their right to vote, their right to absentee ballots. Florida has some actually good laws about that. And their right to be angry when things don't work out the way they should. So we need organizations to educate our young people about what their rights are and about why voting matters. It is not enough to say vote because. It's not, you don't need to vote because people died for it. You don't need to vote because it's hard. You need to vote because you need to live for it. Our lives are directed by the people we choose. Register and vote because we need education. You also, secondly, need to energize. The way to energize kids, energize young people, is to actually engage them in the process. Find a candidate who speaks to you. And if you can't find a candidate, find an issue. But energize people around something that can actually create change, and sometimes it's a small thing. But that small thing becomes a point of entry, and that becomes the way you get people to turn out. So you educate, you energize, and then finally you engage. Go get them. We know that early voting locations are critical, but if for some reason that cannot get resolved, that does not absolve anyone of the responsibility of making sure young people vote. And what organizations can do is get themselves organized just in case, to show up and get people and take them to the polls, because they want you to give up. They want you to be so overwhelmed by how hard it is that you don't try. If we don't get what we want, that's not an excuse to do what we need to do. So say it with me: educate, energize, engage. Number 2. Second question was, raise your hand and I can tell you which question was. Yes, you wanted to know about the National Popular Vote and Electoral College. Electoral College is racist, it's classist, it's obsolete. The problem is, until we change Congress, and that means both chambers, you have to have 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate to get a constitutional amendment, or you have to have a constitutional convention. In a constitutional convention, anything goes. We do not want one of those. It takes 34 states, and you know who lives in America. So we may go in with one intention, but we're going to come out with a lot more than we didn't intend. That's why the national popular vote is so important. I actually sponsored the law in Georgia. We nearly got it through, and then 2016 happened, and they gave up. But the most effective way to change our current structure is the national popular vote movement. I encourage everyone to look it up. It's fantastic. We need to do it. Next, public transit. Public transit, organize and take the people who need this to go to your county commissioners, your city council members. It takes a law. And to get people to do laws, I tell you, politicians are like 15-year-old girls. And I use 15-year-old girls because I was one. We respond to money, peer pressure, and attention. Most of y'all don't have any money, so that's out. But you can put pressure on them by making sure that they see their constituents, and their constituents are asking for this. Because they know that if they don't give constituents something they need, they may not have that job the next time they need it. So work with your local officials. You've got amazing local officials. Talk to them about the process. I don't know if you all do local ballot initiatives, and if you don't, it may just be about talking to state, well, your state legislature will not help you. Talk to your city and county leaders to ask them what the process is. But more than likely, they've never done it because no one's ever asked. Okay? Next person was, yes. Nope, not yet. I got this. Words of wisdom. 1, thank you for running. You are not guaranteed a victory, but we are guaranteed a loss if we don't try. And what you can do is use your platform and your effort to make sure people understand why that job matters. Often America basically thinks we understand what the presidency does, although in recent times nobody knows. But almost every other job is opaque. Your best bet is by making sure the people who need you the most understand why they need you. And that you may not have the resources to reach everyone, but as long as you can convince a group of volunteers, you've got time. Making those phone calls, knocking on doors, letting people understand the issue animates them to do something about it. We've seen it work in Philadelphia, in Chicago, in Georgia. It can be done. You've done it here in Florida. When people know what the job is and when they understand that how it's connected to their lives and to their freedom, people are much more willing to be engaged. But stay the course. It's going to be hard, but you can do it, I believe. Woo! Yes, when I ran for governor of Georgia, I had a gun violence platform. But we know in each state it differs. Florida was the genesis of Stand Your Ground, and you have some of the most perverse gun laws in the country. The only way to undo those laws is to undo the system that created those laws. That's why this election matters so much, but there's another part to this, and that's the census. Florida is going to be a hugely undercounted state because and so faircount.org is an organization I started. We're based in Georgia, but we work across the country, but everyone needs to focus on the census. And the census doesn't sound like an answer to gun violence, but here's why it is. The construction of the Florida legislature is based on gerrymandering, based on who got counted in 2010 and the power they took when they did that count. If you don't get counted, you do not count, and the laws do not change. But if I were someone who cared about an issue, I would make the census my #1 priority, because if we count young people, if we count young people of color, if we count immigrants, you don't have to be a citizen, you have to be a resident. If you live here, if you sleep here, you get counted here. And April 1st through August is the time we tell the story of America. And in Florida, if you tell the story right, you get the power you need and you can change the laws you need to change. Last issue. Now, if I was Secretary of Education, what I would do is invest in K through 12 actually, I would invest through 0 to K and then K through 12 education. We have to educate the whole child. Instead of simply thinking about their minds, we've got to think about their minds, their bodies, their hearts, their souls. And I would make sure that the investment that goes to states comes with stipulations that you have to educate the whole child. We also have to reduce student debt. There are a lot of ways we can think about that. I'm not going to get into that complaint or that conversation because I want to be able to make it out of this room. But the long and short of it is, I would actually center education as a public good, because when you treat it as a public good, our investment doesn't waver. We believe defense is a public good, and we therefore put our money where our mouths are. We have to treat education like a public good and restore the investment. Last question, Vice President. What I said in March of 2019 was that I was not going to run for second place in a primary. If anybody listened to the second part of the clip, I said, but whoever wins the nomination, call me.
Now, before you leave, standing ovation for Leader Stacey Abrams, who is an inspiration to all of us and is doing a motivation. Two quick things before we let her go. She asked about getting involved, the importance of getting involved. There are several ways with the Florida Democratic Party. Brandon Peters is our voter protection director. We have a voter protection program inspired by Leader Abrams. If you want to get involved in voter protection, see Brandon Peters. We also have a tremendous field program. If you want to volunteer, Alejandro, will you come here? Alejandro is here if you want to volunteer. See Alejandro here. Now, Commissioner Monestein, we want to thank you. And again, our thanks to Leader Stacey Abrams, our inspiration.